So one of the things that's really driving the suspicion of people being communist is there is in fact been USSR spies found out in the U.S. government. We do believe, and strong evidence that they did actually support or steal the nuclear blueprints to build a nuclear bomb. It wasn't a coincidence that just 4 years after we had the nuclear weapon, the USSR had nuclear weapons. And this Cold War is it's very much a war of no violence towards each other directly. So most of it's fought through proxy countries, which are other countries that supplement where we actually want to fight each other. And this is the big boy. And this is where it really starts getting violent and things change. This is the Korean War, which starts in 1950 and lasts about 1953. So the Korean War is after almost immediately after World War II, just 5 years, is taking control. So what happens is the northern part, which is supported by the Soviets and Kim Jong Un's grandfather, they lead an invasion and they control into the south, and they want to take over the south and make it all a part of North Korea, which is pro-communist and is considered themselves a communist nation. The South had been very influenced and protected by the United States. Remember, the United States after World War II was in Japan, right across the waters. We helped build Japan into a democracy and help write their constitution, honestly. The Japanese constitution is really based on our creation and supporting them. We actually put some things in there to make sure that they didn't happen again. They don't really have an offensive military is one thing, and that was to make sure that they couldn't invade and take over the world again. And that was our creation. So they spent all their money on other things like education. There's actually been some benefits from that. Both sides agree not to control across this 38th parallel. So we cut this up with the North originally. Say, look, you guys, the Soviets are going to have their sphere of influence over the North. This 38th parallel, and you guys can see it in the middle, it's just an imaginary line. It's just a latitude line. And then anything below this imaginary line, the 30th parallel, is going to be under American protection. And it's going to be a capitalist democracy nation, okay? And this is kind of not a real true agreement in the sense of it's not completely written, but it is set up to go this way. So in 1915, though, the North Korean Communist Army was well armed by the Russians. The USSR did arm them and gave them the weapons. They didn't give them soldiers so that they were directly involved in the combat, but this gave them the power and they allowed them to invade and drive back the South Korean forces. So they attacked, they pushed back. Actually, they pushed back the South Koreans almost to the end of the peninsula. They really were winning. And if you had to guess who is in charge of protecting the South Koreans, it's the Americans. So we're going to get involved in this. Now, we just learned and we did a role play on the United Nations. So what President Truman at the time does is he sends troops and convinces and you can see that little blue area. That's how far back the North American Army or North Korean Army had pushed the South Koreans, this little corner. So he sends in American troops. He says, look, the UN needs to send troops to fight back to the North Koreans. And they agree. They say it's an invasion of a sovereign nation, and the UN supports America. Now, the problem with the UN at the time, and still today, is mostly the UN military is the Americans. So we are their military. So basically, we got the okay from the rest of the world to fight a war against North Korea, which in fact was the USSR basically supporting them. Now, the Chinese gave support to the North Korean army, and the U.S. led the UN forces in the south for over 3 years. So this is where it gets confusing. So while it's almost all exclusively Americans fighting the North Koreans, it was a UN action, and it technically is not a war. And I know people are like, wait a second. I've seen like veterans wear those hats where it says Korean War veteran. We call it the Korean War. Technically, it's not a war because Congress never declared war on North Korea. It's a UN action. However, I don't think it's a good idea to talk to a Korean veteran and tell them that they didn't fight in a war. It is a war. It's violent. It's bloody. People died. They lost their friends. And they fought to protect the South Koreans. And the South Koreans to this day are grateful. And now South Korea is a very wealthy democracy, and they make everything from Samsung to Hyundai and Kia cars. They're a very powerful, wealthy, industrial, technology-based nation now with a great education system. They invest in their education. They've done very well. In 1953, the newly elected President Eisenhower, so the new president takes over, he hinted towards nuclear war. This is how serious this gets, guys. He literally threatens the North Koreans, and even hints at the idea that maybe we'd have to use nuclear bombs against. And it convinced the Chinese and the North Koreans to sign what's called an armistice. So this went on for 3 years, and finally it got to the point where he's using hard power. He's saying, look, I might actually use nuclear weapons if you guys don't get out of there. This is not your territory. And it works. It's very effective, scares the snot out of the North Koreans and the Chinese. The Americans protected the South pretty well for the time. But there's no true winner in this war. So we call it a stalemate. So officially it's a stalemate. And an armistice is a truce or an agreement to end a war. Here's the interesting thing. The war, technically, the armistice, the truce agreement, it's just never ended. It's just there's really not been any true consequences on paper from this. It's all been actually, the 30th parallel is back there. And if you ever watch videos, we'll show you videos, they literally stand on the border and stare at each other. And if somebody tries to cross the border from the north side to the south, the North Koreans will shoot them. Because a lot of North Koreans are trying to leave. They're trying to get out. You can't even own a cell phone in North Korea. They're not playing with you. They are a totalitarian government, which means their government has total control of their people. And they're not allowed to cell phones. They cannot read Bibles. There was actually a woman that was arrested for leaving a Bible underneath her chair at a restaurant. And she was American in North Korea, and that's against the law. You can't bring in religion or any of these things. And she went to jail. She did. There's a guy who's putting up posters, and he was arrested. And one guy even died. Like, he didn't make the trip back to America when he was freed. So they're pretty ruthless. Some people will go on vacation in North Korea. I would not. I think they do it for adventure. Now this leads to the next idea of what's called containment policy. So North Korea and Eisenhower is led with this idea. There's a Keegan. He goes Dr. X, and he says, look, we need a game plan when it comes to USSR, and what we got to do is we got a containment policy. And the containment policy is this. Our goal is to make sure that we contain communism in the USSR from spreading. China's communist now. North Korea's communist now. It's spreading in Asia like wildfire in their minds. And then Iran was pro-USSR. So we're going to do things and do what we got to do to make sure that the USSR loses its power and its spirit influence on other nations. So this is a big one. Now, this is an amazing story. What happens in Iran is they had a pro-Soviet Iranian government, and we wanted to install a Shah, a pro-American Shah that would trade oil with us and interact with us. So we did, and this is serious, the CIA got involved. They basically created a fake uprising against the Iranians. They hired, essentially, they would call thugs, really tough people. They'd pay them to just start beating and attacking people and overthrow the country. And it worked. It's crazy, but it worked. And they put the Shah of Iran in power, which was a vicious dictator, ruthless towards his people. And this did not work out very well. But it let Iran gave us oil for many years, and we were friends with Iran and this horrible Shah that was abusing and attacking people way until the uprising in the 70s. Also, the communists supported a Guatemalan president, Jacob Guzman, who was eventually overthrown by the American-led military revolution. So again, there's other examples. Guatemala, the CIA, helps a revolution to overthrow a democratically elected president. Nicaragua had a democratically elected president. We helped the Sandinistas, and we helped them overthrow the president. They put in a dictator. Because we went with who was pro-America. And it didn't matter as much as if they're a dictator or not. It wasn't all about democracy. It was very much about, are they on America's side, or are they on the USSR side? And that's why we call these proxy wars. There's all this fighting going around the globe, and it wasn't a hot war where America is actually fighting USSR head on. It was a Cold War where we're fighting them indirectly through other nations and proxy nations. All right, I got a CIA joke. I got to tell it. I'm sorry. It's good stuff. An American tells a Russian that the United States is so free that he can stand in front of the White House and yell, "To hell with Ronald Reagan," which was the president in the 1980s. And then the Russian replies, "This nothing. I can stand in front of the Kremlin and yell, 'To hell with Ronald Reagan too.'" You get it? Because he's our president. They don't care. Okay. All right. Hopefully you're laughing. All right, Sputnik. Now this really changes the game. We'll get into this next one. Is Sputnik. In 1957, you see that little tiny ball with antennas coming off of it? That changes everything. Sputnik, I think I'm saying it, Sputnik. In 1957, the USSR launched the first satellite in the world called Sputnik. And Sputnik is insane. Now we have a satellite in outer space. The Russians are the first to win. They're in outer space before the Americans. This scares everybody. We talked about the bombs race, how the Americans are making more accurate nuclear missiles, but the Russians are making bigger nuclear weapons to scare us. We're going back and forth. Now we got a satellite. So we're thinking, what can they do with a satellite? All kinds of stuff, right? You guys know we can do satellites today. The launch of Sputnik it creates what's called the space race, and that starts in 1957 with Sputnik. And the space race was a Cold War competition between the U.S. and the USSR to use math and science to propel the first person into space. So America freaks out. Now we've got a satellite flying around in the air or in outer space watching us. Think what they could do. They could take pictures of us. They could send radio communications. And then they even talk about, well, maybe they could shoot missiles from the outer space. That would be much more accurate. This scares the snot out of us. So this is actually interesting. This is the one time we really start investing in education, believe it or not. And after 1957, the president, especially John F. Kennedy, says, look, we got to start spending tons of money on public education. We got to get American students and they're caught up in math and science. The Russians were beating us, and USSR was beating us in math and science. Their professors, they're doing better. They're in outer space. Then they start launching monkeys in outer space. That scared the heck out of us even more. So American was going to spend all this money and time, like World War II, and all our resources on winning the space race. And one of the positive consequences really was that public schools start having smaller class size. We start spending more money on math and science and resources for you guys as students. So it wasn't all bad. And it did result in, later we'll talk about the first man going into outer space.